this up a little bit. Hi, my name is Ben Shear. I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Education in CU Boulder in the Research Evaluation Methodology program. You may hear some people talk about REM. That's what that is. Once again, it's really wonderful that you're all here. Thank you again for being here. Thank you everyone for being on time to sessions, for your patience as we get everything going. Hopefully you're enjoying the food. It's very exciting for me to be able to introduce our keynote speakers at the second keynote of the conference. I have to say it's a little bit daunting to introduce this group of scholars, but it's also very exciting. So our first speaker, we'll have 3 speakers and then a discussant. The first speaker will be Dr. Bill Penuel, who's a professor of learning sciences and director of the National Center for Research in Policy and Practice here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Penuel studies curriculum materials assessments, both designs and studies curriculum materials assessments and professional learning experiences for teachers in science. He works in partnership with school districts and state departments of education and conducts research in support of educational equity. As the principal investigator of the National Center for Research in Policy and Practice, a knowledge utilization center funded by the IES, Dr. Penuel studies how school and district leaders use research. Our second speaker will be Dr. Angela DeBarger. Dr. DeBarger is a program officer in education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Her portfolio addresses the intersection of deeper learning and open educational resource strategies with the aim of creating inclusive, purposeful, and coherent learning experiences for students and teachers. Previously, Dr. DeBarger served as a senior program officer for Lucas Education Research at the George Lucas Educational Foundation and as an education researcher at SRI International. Our third speaker will be Dr. Erin Furtick, who's also a professor of science education and the associate dean of faculty here at the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education. Dr. Furtak is a former high school science teacher and studies how science teachers learn and improve their daily classroom practices through formative assessment practices. Her research and professional writing has been published in multiple articles in a number of venues, both peer-reviewed and practitioner and general audience books, and humorous essays and advice columns. They're quite fun if you have a chance to check them out. She also conducts extensive service to the teaching profession through long-term research and professional development partnerships with school districts and organizations in Colorado and across the U.S. And then finally, we'll have a discussant, Dr. Margaret Heritage, who's an internationally recognized expert in formative assessment. She is currently an independent consultant in education and a senior advisor to West Ed. Prior to these roles, she spent 22 years at UCLA, first as principal of the laboratory school at the UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences, and then as an assistant director at the National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals, edited books, and practitioner journals, and she has recently co-authored 2 books about the intersection of learning, formative assessment, and self-regulation. So I know this was sort of quite a bit of accolades and things to list through, but I did want to make sure that everyone appreciated kind of just how much both research expertise and also practical experience in schools and classrooms is reflected by our speakers here today, although I think that would become apparent pretty quickly. And although I think any one of these speakers alone would make for a fabulous keynote session, we have the great fortune to hear from all 3 of them, well, I guess all 4 of them, with the discussant. So without further ado, I'd encourage everyone to take another sip of water to remember to stay hydrated. And then please welcome our first speaker.
Thank you, Ben. So the title that appears in your program is Assessment for Curricular Efficacy, or as we're really going to talk about is how the subject, classroom practice, and partnerships matter for equitable systems change. And those will be some themes that we're going to highlight today. It's really an honor to be able to share the stage with good friends and colleagues today. Angela DeBarger from Hewlett Foundation and Erin Furtick from here at CU, and to be joined on stage by our discussant, Margaret Heritage, who's someone whose work in classroom assessment I've appreciated and learned from my whole career. And it's an honor because I've had the chance over the years the 3 of us have had the chance to learn from each other through the collaboration in our research, but also the overlap in our career trajectories and in research. And also in preparing for today, we were able to explore a number of themes that came out of our scholarship that we think are pertinent to this particular community. So as we prepared our presentations, we asked ourselves some questions of how we came to see the subject as mattering for assessment. And by subject, we mean a few things, but in particular, our shared area of science education. We also explored how and when we've seen formative assessment be a lever for change at both the classroom and system level. That is, seeing it as connected in ways that this community hopes is possible for broader systems of assessment in a coherent way. All of us have also been involved in partnerships, a key theme at this conference, and we also explore partnerships here in this talk. And finally, we consider how equity shows up in our work. And by that, we mean both a commitment to ensuring that all students have access to powerful opportunities to learn, as well as the ways in which we attend to cultural and linguistic diversity in our work. We decided after a couple of takes on this to organize our talks around key turning points or developments in our own thinking about classroom assessment and its relationship to the broader infrastructure that guides instruction in states, districts, and schools, particularly the elements of curriculum and external tests. We do so to situate our own insights about classroom assessment in particular experiences, which, as all experiences are both revelatory and partial. And also as a reminder that this work in assessment is fundamentally a human and cultural endeavor, animated by values and shaped by the practices and institutions in which we are embedded ourselves. So I will start by talking a little bit about my search for coherence and equity, moving from work with teachers and into partnerships. My journey into science education began at SRI International, where, as a research scientist for 13 years there before joining the faculty here at CU Boulder. And one of my first assignments when coming to SRI was to join the evaluation program that was studying the GLOBE program. The GLOBE program is both a science and education program, based right here now in Boulder, that engages students in a form of structured citizen science learning, focused on inquiry in Earth system science. Though not trained at all as a science education researcher, my GLOBE assignment excited me because I had a long-standing interest in geography and in public participation in science. The assignment was really my first exposure to science assessment as well. I was assigned to work with some more senior colleagues with backgrounds in cognitive science and assessment design, but given primary responsibility for figuring out how to develop an assessment of the particular learning outcomes that GLOBE students might achieve. Pretty quickly, I realized that the program didn't align to any particular standards. Some of the content wasn't in standards at all. And from my read of early evaluation reports, there was wide variability in how teachers were implementing the program and how teachers used the resources available for that. I came to appreciate just how varied the forms of expertise, too, were that I would need to do this work in assessment well, including developing an understanding of the science at hand, learning sciences, and assessment design. Through my studies of GLOBE, I became really curious, too, about what people took up in curriculum materials and began to work with colleagues like Barry Fishman to learn from the variation that we were seeing in implementation. Being an evaluator made me focus on the curriculum as the main figure in this, with participants and their context as the ground. When we study curricula, we're often focused on studying if and when curricula improve learning outcomes. But we often miss the when, the who, and the under what conditions part if we don't bring context and people to the fore. We kept running into, as a recurring finding of our implementation studies in GLOBE, the importance of perceived coherence of resources and professional development with teachers' goals and learning contexts. When teachers see the coherence, they took materials up. And when teachers don't see materials, when researchers go away, they stop using them. That is, despite policy efforts in some states that we were even studying to align the standards, the assessments, and the resources all together, we didn't see teachers taking them up. And I began to wonder for the first time, what can it actually mean to support teachers in beginning to see coherence when it's there? But also, what can we do beyond assuring alignment at the top level, looking at standards, assessment, and materials together by some externally defined criterion for alignment? And I got my first chance to explore these questions in a project with one of my co-presenters here on stage, Angela DeBarger. The project, Contingent Pedagogies, would be the first in what would become a long-term partnership with Denver Public Schools. In it, we work with Denver teachers and administrators to adapt a set of embedded assessments in a middle school or science curriculum to provide what we hoped would be better evidence of student learning of core ideas that are embedded in the materials, and help teachers solve the perpetual what's next problem. Now that I have assessment evidence that my students are having difficulty, what do I do next? We developed a number of strategies to help teachers make sense of student ideas and gave them a set of alternative ways through the materials. The success of this particular project wasn't in the uptake of those ideas, but in many ways it was the right, tight integration of work to integrate curriculum, assessment, and achieve coherence through working in partnership with district leaders. We showed that teachers could be involved in purposeful adaptation of assessments, and in so doing, their practice improved and their students learned more. Teachers, for their part, did see the tight integration of curriculum, assessment, and district purpose, though we weren't as successful as in engaging the district partnership continuously as we had been in working with teachers. We were far away in California, too, making the relationship cultivation more of a challenge. The particular assessments that we developed, they're not in use anymore. They didn't last, and a larger vision for science education was shifting from inquiry to a focus on science practices, and a vision for science education that puts students' interests, experiences, and identity more front and center. The curriculum materials themselves fell into disuse among teachers. This was a humbling turn of events and caused me to ask a new set of questions. What is it that can last, if anything, when an effort such as this one, where design and use of assessments were at the center of an effort to promote coherence, comes to an end? And how can whatever I do begin to grapple with the challenge of promoting equity through tighter connections among curriculum, assessment, and students' identities? I'd become aware of some work in Washington by Carrie So and Phil Bell to really integrate students' everyday lives into curriculum. And looking at the materials that we were working with, I could see they fell short. I saw teachers reaching and trying to make their own connections with students in our classroom videos. And I saw how they drew on teachers' own life experiences and interests, but they weren't really good at eliciting students' experiences. So fortunately, my relationship to Denver continued, and I moved here to Colorado, joining forces with a colleague here, Tammy Sumner, to strengthen this partnership, and immediately understood that one thing that lasted was the partnership itself, and that the success had created conditions for more productive work together. As the partnership evolved, the district asked us to shift focus to high school, and our Inquiry Hub partnership in 2014 began to take on the challenge of preparing teachers to implement the next generation science standards. As we had with Contingent Pedagogies, we began by establishing a design team comprised of district leaders and teachers, and added a partner, Northwestern University, to help us with curriculum design. Members of our team brought a lot of expertise in the vision of new standards, curriculum, and assessment. But it was always also clear to us from the get-go that creating and supporting a new curriculum would be challenging. Colorado had not yet adopted the new standards. The state assessment reflected and still reflects the old standards, not the challenging new ones. We couldn't get away with just developing curriculum. We had to work with our partners to develop a system of assessments, not just to make it so that teachers would have the possibility of seeing the guidance they were getting as coherence. So to support coherence, we've developed a system of assessments that supports the vision of teaching and learning that underlies the curriculum materials. And one of these elements starts with the very choice of the problems or phenomena that anchor these curriculum materials, an interest survey. Our team at CU has developed a process that includes both a careful analysis of standards and opportunity to incorporate student voice into the choice of these anchors through an interest survey whose results are disaggregated by race, gender, and home language. You can visit a poster of ours this evening, too, to see a second piece. Deborah Ball mentioned a form of exit tickets that she used focused on math. Well, we've developed exit tickets that focus on elicitation of students' experiences in science classrooms, and it's a key metric that we use to measure progress in our partnership. This particular set of assessments is one of the ways we hold ourselves to account for equitable outcomes. The student electronic exit tickets embedded in students ask questions about their experience of the day's lesson. Did it make sense from their point of view? Help them make progress in explaining the anchoring phenomenon for the unit. Was it interesting and relevant to their everyday lives and the people in their community? Did they contribute to knowledge building in the class? And if so, were their ideas taken up by others? We look at how student experiences vary by race, gender, and home language, and are investigating that now through a grant from the Spencer Foundation that focuses on how teachers can use these data formatively to improve equity of participation in their classroom. This picture shows the kind of supports that we've created at the district level as part of our system. And I'll say the hardest part of us has been synchronizing our efforts with the ongoing development and revision of district unit tests, which are also akin to interim assessments. It's required exceptional vigilance on the part of the partnership to ensure that we remain aligned to the vision of 3D assessment. A name we've given to building these infrastructural supports and crafting coherence as a partnership is infrastructuring, which refers to the efforts to redesign various forms of guidance in partnership with teachers and district leaders to work toward a particular vision for science teaching, in this case, that of the next generation science standards. We're 5 years into this particular current effort, and the work of coherence making feels unfinished, as do our efforts to promote equity. Big questions are front and center for me now in this work are, how do we sustain this work, given that coherence making requires continuous joint work among our partners? How can we integrate young people's voices more into this work in ways that are meaningful and not tokenizing, and give them more of a say, not just in curriculum, but in assessing the quality of their experience in the classroom? And finally, what role, if any, should coordination with state partners in assessment play in our work as we look to the future when the state will create assessments aligned to these new standards? And fortunately, we have our state partners in the room here today from CDE, so I hope to continue this particular conversation with them after this talk as I turn the podium over to my colleague Angela.
Well, I have to start by saying that it was actually really fun to prepare for this talk today and to reflect on my experiences in education and assessment that brought me to the work that I do today. I grew up in a family of educators. My mom was an elementary school teacher, and my dad was a high school principal for most of his career. But even with that, education wasn't something that I thought I would take on for my career. I didn't dream of being an assessment researcher or program officer, for that matter. But there was a shift for me that happened when I was in college. I started college as a chemistry major. I had really awesome high school chemistry teachers, Mrs. Hybricks, Mrs. Noel, who helped me see how science was a way to understand the world and how the world worked. So started out as a chemistry major and then hit a wall when I got to organic chemistry. I really struggled with it. I couldn't figure out why I wasn't successful, and it caused me to question who I was as a learner, how I learned best, what excited me about learning. And it was around that same time that I became interested in psychology, and in particular the idea that situations can really shape people's behavior and affect how people learn. So I really dug into that and became more curious about questions like how do we create meaningful, inclusive environments where every every student feels capable, confident, able to show what they know and are able to do. So fast forward several years, and I worked at SRI International with Bill, and the first NSF grant that I got to work on was actually on classroom assessment in chemistry. And it was a collaboration with Jim Minstrel, who's at Facet Innovations, and Carlos Ayala, who was a friend from graduate school and then was at Sonoma State. And really, we were trying to, the goal of this project was to work with chemistry teachers to figure out how we can anticipate the ideas and experiences that students bring to the classroom and really build on those through instruction. I was really excited to map out these clusters and to figure out design principles for diagnostic question sets. And I think there's a lot I could share with you about the successes and challenges with that kind of approach to assessment. But there are three things that stick with me today. First of all, I grew to appreciate how challenging it is to anticipate the ideas that students bring to the classroom, and you really can't fully anticipate that. And I'm not sure that, in retrospect, the questions that we designed were fully bringing into and inviting students' experiences into the classroom. But one positive outcome for me of the work was realizing the benefit of what we called elicitation questions. So these very open-ended questions that teachers might pose at the beginning of instruction to really see how students are making sense of phenomena. And I found that those were really rich opportunities for discourse, for students to express curiosities about each other and each other's thinking, and to lay that foundation for inclusive classroom practices. And then my third takeaway from this work is that designing a whole system of supplemental tools and assessments that were distinct from teachers' curriculum introduced challenges. We spent a lot of time working with teachers trying to figure out how to map our approach to chemistry with their curriculum that they were either required to teach by the district or that they had been successful in teaching. And so as a result, some of our assessments weren't being used by the teachers. So we really took this to heart in our work with the Contingent Pedagogies project, and you heard about that experience with Bill. So I'll just highlight a few things that stick with me from that project. One is that it really was an opportunity for me to practice and learn how to more deeply co-design with teachers and really more deeply integrate curriculum and assessment as we were working with these 6th grade earth science teachers. At our professional developments, we used to always or often show this slide of a cockpit and laugh about how we were building the plane as we were flying it, and we didn't know where we would go, but we were all in it together. And in retrospect, I feel like I was sort of building the plane and flying it too, in terms of learning how to develop a partnership with a district. That was the first time I had really deeply engaged with a district, and Patty Kincaid, who was in Denver Public Schools and overseeing the work of science education at the time, was really instrumental in helping us find teachers who would be comfortable with the messiness of co-design, and making sure that we had the space and the time for professional development, and in participating in conversations with us so that we can make sure that the work that we were doing was advancing district priorities. So I've carried all of this forward even as I've transitioned from the role of assessment researcher into program officer. And my first opportunity to serve as a program officer was at the George Lucas Educational Foundation with a group called Lucas Education Research. And there we were focused on developing and studying project-based learning. And I think part of the reason that the foundation took up this focus on project-based learning was to challenge the notion that project-based learning was not rigorous, that it was opportunity maybe for students to have fun, but they weren't going to meet standards. And we thought there was a way where we could actually have meaningful experiences and address rigorous learning goals. And assessment was a key piece of how we approached that work. So these are design principles, but I'd say particularly the component around using evidence informed practice was where assessment hooked in. And it was interesting to watch how different teams thought about this integration of project-based learning and assessments. And just to share one example, team that I got to collaborate with closely was with the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, or SCALE. And they were interested in exploring the idea of connecting project-based learning and performance-based assessment. So in the projects that they developed, each project had a driving question that students would work toward over a number of weeks. And then there were tasks that were integrated at key points in the instruction. So I guess these tasks were opportunities for checkpoints on learning, but they were also opportunities for students to gather evidence that informed how they might answer the driving question. And every unit concluded with culminating assessments, both a group assessment and an individual assessment. And we saw this as a more equitable approach to learning for a few reasons. One, there were ways that students could build on their shared experiences from the project-based experience from the projects and apply those in the assessments. And there were multiple opportunities through the projects for students to demonstrate their understanding and show what they're able to do. And we found that with a quasi-experimental study, students who participated in this science curriculum actually did better on state math and English language tests, and students who were English learners performed better on the test of English language proficiency. So then now at the Hewlett Foundation, I'm trying to think about how to take all of this and how it applies in the work that I get to do today. And it's an interesting time to be at the foundation. We're actually making a shift to a more place-based approach in terms of the kinds of partnerships that we're developing. So we're trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to support deeper work with districts? And it's going to be a lot of listening to what the districts want to work on, but I'm hopeful that there will be more opportunities to think about how to coordinate curriculum, assessment, instruction, professional development, so that there are more opportunities for deeper learning for more students, and so that we can create the sustainable systems and structures so this work can carry forward. And as we develop partnerships in multiple places, I think we'd like to be able to speak to and identify new exemplars of teacher practice, knowledge about how to transform systems and sustain productive changes. And then share out what we're learning, not just among those of us like in the education community, but to the broader public, so that more people can understand what success looks like and how this kind of change can happen in public schools. So as I think about all of this and what I hope to get from my experience at the conference over this next day or so, I'm really excited to look for sessions where I can continue to learn about what it means to work in partnership with teachers, with districts, to bridge the curriculum and assessment, and to think together with you about like what the opportunities and challenges are for developing equitable and sustainable systems that support teaching and learning. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just echo what both Bill and Angela have said, that it was really a lot of fun to go on this autobiographical journey together with both of you over the last month. And I'm going to start my story in my high school classroom at Wheat Ridge High School, which is located about 25 miles to the south of here. Woo, farmers, go farmers. Wow, I did not plan on saying that. Anyway, it's amazing because our dean is really excited that we're building a new building for the School of Education, and we were all told to clean out all of our stuff. And I'm really excited that I didn't take this advice yet, because I found the field notes that I collected when I was doing my master's thesis 18 years ago for screenshots for the presentation today. So I'm glad that I kept my stuff. But basically, my journey in science education research really started with questions that came out of my own teaching practice. I have a degree in biology, and like all biology teachers, when I got hired to teach earth science, not biology. And I was really grappling with this content, in some cases astronomy, that I hadn't learned since I was in the 9th grade myself, teaching this now to 9th graders. And I just leaned right into this with questions that I was asking myself about assessment. Namely, how can students have a voice in assessment? Why are we the ones who are always telling them how they're going to show us what they know. And I convened focus groups of my 9th graders and asked them this question, basically, brainstorming different ways that they might be assessed, and we kind of co-constructed together an approach by which students embodied performances, and I don't mean like traditional performance assessment, but actually learning performances where they did skits and told stories about Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which just kind of as a shorthand, thinking about how planets are moving more slowly as they're farthest from the sun in orbit and then speed up as they get closer. And this was a totally revelatory experience to me and my students. We designed rubrics together, and we thought about how we might assess whether they understand this. And then I did a reflection with them on February 1st, 2001, where I asked them, do we have to test? Or can we just assess in some less formal way? And I still have multiple I was shocked that I still had these. I had all these stacks of student responses to this. Many of the students really loved it, and they said, I loved getting to show you what I know in kind of an untraditional way. But I pulled this one as an example because the student was saying, there wasn't really a feeling when Ms. Furtak talked to us. It was just a weird thing because nobody's ever asked me this before. And it was really the questions that bubbled up when working with my students that led me to go to graduate school and to keep chewing on these questions. And so I was fortunate to get to Stanford University when Rich Shavelson and Ayuta Ruiz Primo were kicking off an experimental study of teacher use of formative assessment, curriculum-embedded formative assessment on student learning and motivation. And so the whole first year I was in graduate school, we as a research team sat and designed formative assessments, and then we went and trained teachers in how to use these. This is just an example of a predict, observe, explain assessment that we wrote, where we were asking students questions about what makes things sink and float, looking for density and buoyancy-based explanations of this phenomenon. And this is just a picture of some straws that we used that students had to predict how far these would sink or float in water, observe what happened, and then reconcile their predictions with their explanations. And similar to some comments that Bill and Angela have already made, teachers learned how to use these assessments, and then when the research project was over, for my dissertation, I went back and interviewed many of these teachers, and I was really astonished, because I was new at this, that many of them weren't doing it now that the research infrastructure was gone. They were using kind of their favorite assessments, but not all of them. To the teachers' credit, there were many, many, many assessments that we had developed, and they were using the ones that they liked the most. But what was really surprising to me when I went back and talked to the teachers is that underlying the ways that they were thinking about student ideas was a representation that we had actually not even really intended for the teachers in the first place, was what we called the fast developmental trajectory of students' evolving conceptions of density and relative buoyancy, which is basically AKA kind of an early prototype learning progression that we had used with the teachers. And the teachers were using the language of the learning progression when they were talking about how complicated it is to interpret the ways students talk about what makes things sink and float. And it really kind of kicked me off on this research trajectory myself of how can representations like this help provide maps that teachers can kind of informally use in these assessment conversations, in looking at student work to help interpret student thinking and leverage them forward in instruction. And so I kind of took up this way of thinking about learning progressions in my own research, particularly as it applies to assessment co-design and then doing informal assessment with students in the classroom. And so thinking about informal assessment is something that might be oriented around a purpose or goal, and we're using learning progressions as kind of the embodiment of those goals. And then think about teachers noticing or eliciting student thinking, making inferences about what students know, and then acting on those inferences to inform instruction. And so I started asking questions about, well, how can assessment in this way be a lever for change at the classroom level? Not only just working with teachers and professional learning communities to co-design these assessments as learning opportunities for them, but then also to see how this affected their classroom practice. And so over a period of about 10 years, working with some really incredible doctoral students, we developed this approach which we call the formative assessment design cycle, which basically involves teachers working with the facilitator to set learning goals as they're represented by a learning progression, and then to design and revise tools themselves. So now we're not talking about kind of researchers developing these tasks, but actually using these as a learning opportunity for teachers to develop these. And then to think about, how does this represent what we mean about formative assessment? And we go into a classroom, it's not just the task, but it's also the practices that we use to kind of support and draw out and build on student thinking. Then teachers all go and use the tasks in their classrooms with students and collect data, student response data, and then they bring that back to our professional learning community where we talk about it together, use a learning progression to interpret those ideas, and then make plans for subsequent instruction. And we found over multiple studies conducted at the secondary level that engaging in this process is really a vital learning opportunity for teachers to think about what a formative assessment is, what that looks like in their classroom, to refine their own understandings of science, to have better ways of eliciting and then noticing those student ideas and then providing better feedback. And all these are associated with improvements in student learning. And now, I am very fortunate to have a partnership with the Aurora Public School District, along with my co-PI, Derek Briggs, where we're kind of starting to look now at partnership as a vehicle for systems-wide change, taking this idea of formative assessment design to kind of the next level and really thinking about this question of how can we develop a comprehensive approach to science assessment that's not just formative assessment, but other forms of assessment that will support shifts in teachers' classroom practices. So I have to give props to Clarissa Deverell Rico, who made this really amazing figure that shows the intensity of this kind of formative assessment co-design work that we do with teachers. So the kind of our design cycle is up there on the upper right-hand corner, but you can kind of see what this looks like unfolding over a period of a semester. So this is 4 months of meetings with a high school biology professional learning community where teachers are meeting twice a month with an external facilitator that kind of takes them through these routines with the support of different resources and tools like learning progressions, like unit planning maps, sample assessments to kind of iteratively revise these over time to think about how they're going to use them with students and then ultimately use them with their kids and then reflect on next steps for instruction. And as we've been doing this, we've been linking what we're trying to do with this new vision of science learning that both of my colleagues alluded to, the next generation science standards, and how can we have assessments that really look like this vision of assessment. And this is where my story kind of starts to come full circle, because one of our district partners once described what we're trying to do in our project as doing work on Pluto, where we're kind of working with this vision of assessment that isn't exactly what's happening in classrooms yet, but we're getting there. And actually in putting this presentation together, I started thinking about Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And when I first heard this metaphor, I was thinking, well, this is maybe a picture of Pluto at its pretty far outer orbit, but as it gets closer, we build more momentum to support and shift classroom practices. But I also want to ask a few questions that have arisen over the course of the work that I've done in the past 10 to 12 years. So as many of you know, I've been doing work in developing learning progressions, using these with teachers, and in a different study conducted in a different school district many years ago, we co-constructed a learning progression with a group of biology teachers. And what was really fascinating to me was that we spent all this time kind of documenting how student learning would develop and what ideas students are bringing to the classroom, that in some instances were taken up as ways of identifying when students had misconceptions and then trying to correct those misconceptions, rather than kind of thinking about how can different levels of a learning progression provide us information to interpret student ideas, see what's there in student thinking. But I call this kind of the dark side of learning progressions, which is kind of an emergent theme that I've noticed across several studies I've done, where even the act of representing something in a linear way implies linear ways of learning, which we know don't actually map on to the way that students learn. And so this is one potential downside to that. And so in my current work, I'm really trying to think about more equitable task design for emergent bilingual students. I also give props to my, I guess you're not my graduate student now, Caitlin Fine, no longer my advisee, but my collaborator, who has been asking these questions about how can we maintain alignment and rigor while increasing our ability to find out what emergent bilingual students and students from diverse linguistic backgrounds know and are able to do in science. And so we've been trying to develop frameworks for thinking about this in terms of the actual tasks that we design, baking this in from the beginning so that as we make better NGSS-aligned tasks, we can also be thinking about how those tasks are designed to really get the ideas and resources that our learners bring to the classroom. So we can think about things like graphic organizers. We can think about checklists that don't just tell students what a model is, but tell them the kind of ideas that might go into these models, what might be represented, and then encouraging students to really draw on their diverse linguistic resources, such as through translanguaging when they're giving explanations. And we're also trying to rethink the way that we build learning progressions to bring to teachers. We still engage them in processes of co-design around things that go in the learning progressions, but much more focused on what are we looking for in student ideas? What are the students bringing? How can we build on those and leverage those in instruction? And I'm also left with a few lingering questions as I look back across all of these studies. You know, we're spending really a lot of time developing better assessments for things like the next generation science standards that are based on students' lived experiences, that are linked to phenomena. And then in many cases, we have to then put these assessment items into online systems that constrain our ability to find out what students know. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that this is a real risk of kind of taking our new conceptualizations of assessment and kind of shoehorning them into older visions of what tests have been and not what they could be. And then secondly, I'm also really concerned with this idea of how we can create assessments that empower students to really use their resources and not, as a result of sticking kind of with older ways of thinking about tests, falling into a trap where our new assessments might just end up serving as instruments of further marginalization and oppression of students. So these are just kind of lingering questions that I'm grappling with, and I look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you over the next days. Thanks.
Well, thank you to the three of you for some really interesting thoughts, and I'm delighted to have been asked to be discussant on this session. I've titled my discussion Lost in Translation, ? Because what we've been hearing about are partnerships, which are powerful ways to change practice. We've also been hearing about visions of curriculum and assessment. And my concern is how those visions get translated into the daily work of classrooms. I want to connect specifically, Laurie Shepherd mentioned this morning, the principles that are being derived or developed as a result of this conference, and I'm going to connect what I talk about now with two of them: integrating curriculum instruction and assessment based on well-founded theories of learning, which we heard from our keynote this morning, and valuing student ideas by presenting tasks in multiple modes. And I'm going to particularly focus on the valuing student ideas portion of this. I want to claim, first of all, that classroom assessment is a tool for pedagogy. Nothing else, a tool for pedagogy. And we heard about the powerful pedagogy this morning, grounded in the underlying theory of socio-cultural opportunities. Laurie, that it best accounts for the social nature of learning, allows for different entry points. It integrates theories of motivation, identity, development, cognitive aspects of learning, and it focuses on ways of knowing, doing, and being specific to each discipline. And we heard from Deborah this idea of ambitious teaching and what that actually looks like in the classroom with the underlying sociocultural theory. And yes, fish can be ambitious. And from Deborah, the focus on student thinking, the student thinking was front and center. The identities and resources that students bring to the classroom are taken seriously, and that students are positioned as smart. All students are positioned as smart. So that was the groundwork we had this morning. Ambitious teaching within an underlying theory, sociocultural theory. And so I'm questioning well-founded theories. We heard about well-founded theories, but let's think about the theories in the classroom. And this is taken, I'm shamelessly promoting this. This is my latest book that's going to be come out. I'll give you a couple of minutes to write down the title. Except if I do, Derek Briggs is going to be up here beating me up because he says I've got too many slides. So I've told him I'm going to get this in 15 minutes. So anyway, this is a new book co-authored with Christine Harrison from King's College London. And what we talk about in the book is that teachers have theories, or at least domain assumptions that consciously or unconsciously guide their work. And that how teachers view assessment goes hand in hand with the pedagogical approach that they adopt as a result of their view or their theory of how students learn. We got a different picture of Pluto. And I thought this was very powerful when Erin talked in her presentation about here we are feeling like we're on Pluto creating assessments while instruction is still back on Earth. And this is my big worry, which is why I've talked about lost in translation. Because to me, what we see in classrooms today is variations upon this theme. To a greater or lesser extent, the kind of paradigm that we've seen in education, certainly since I went to school, which was a long time ago. I know you can't really believe that, but it was. So variations on this theme, and I think the first thing that I want to propose, and I hear teachers say this a lot, that they have really got to rethink the work of teaching, to change that paradigm of teaching. And I think they've really got to rethink the work of learning. And not just teachers rethink the work of learning, but students also. And part of our charge, I think, is to rethink the work of classroom assessment. How does that work to support the kinds of theoretical underpinnings that Laurie shared with us this morning and the ambitious pedagogy that Deborah also described? So Bill talks about a system of assessments that supports the vision of teaching and learning that underlies the curriculum materials. However, that vision to be realized, no matter what you provide to teachers, in the end, they have to translate that into their own practice. They have to take the guidance they're given and put that into lesson design, the kind of interactions they're going to have in the classrooms, as we saw from Deborah this morning. Some of those can be fraught with challenges. And they have to design for equity in their classroom. This is a big ask for teachers who remain in that fixed paradigm of stand and deliver and transmit. And so what I worry about is that without the partnerships, without support, teachers are going to be trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It's just not going to work. And for all the years I've been in education, on 2 continents, this is what I've seen over and over and over again. The square peg and the round hole. So the square peg persists, and the round hole, I don't know what happens to it. So I want to draw from 2 British scholars, Torrance and Pryor, because I think their conception of assessment, which I want to translate into conceptions of pedagogy, are very helpful. They talk about convergent and divergent assessment. So convergent assessment is really trying to identify whether the student knows, understands, or can do a predetermined thing. Can you do this? Do you know this? And in this context, the analysis of the interaction in the student is, and the curriculum rather, is from the point of view of the curriculum. Now, in divergent assessment, this emphasizes the learner's understanding and what the student knows and understands. And I would argue that the kind of teaching that we saw in Deborah's video this morning was an example of divergent teaching. And so the analysis of the interaction of the student and the curriculum are from the point of view of the student. So in rethinking teaching, and you might say, that's a really old picture, but whiteboard, put him in a cute haircut, smart glasses, polo shirt, what's the diff? And in this idea of convergent teaching, which stems from teachers' theories about how children learn, the lesson is according to a fixed curriculum, no flexibility. They stick to a sequence of activities because it's there. I climb Mount Everest because it's there. I go through the curriculum because it's there, and I have to cover it, and I have to cover it so quickly, and does it really matter if kids get it or don't get it? And here the opportunity to learn is that students have all been exposed to the same content. So what does that mean in terms of assessment? Focuses on accuracy and correctness. How does that help pedagogy? It's closed or pseudo-opening questioning and tasks, judgmental or qualitative evaluation. A view of assessment is done by the teacher and the involvement of students as recipients of assessment. I don't think that's what these guys have been talking about. I don't think it's what Laurie and Deborah were talking about this morning. Now, if we think about divergent teaching, flexible planning. There is a plan, there is a goal, but it's not fixed in stone, it's flexible because you're responding to student ideas as the lesson unfolds. Students are engaged in discourse as a source of learning and also a source of evidence for teachers. They're involved in the practices of the discipline as apprentices, and the opportunity to learn there is building on students' existing mental representations, a completely different take on teaching and learning, depending on that theoretical stance. And so here, the focus is for assessment on understanding, qualitative insights, which Laurie talked about this morning, leading to teachers making judgments about what's next for this child, often in the moment. And the view of assessment is done jointly by teachers and by students, and the involvement of students as initiators of assessment. And frankly, I wish we were talking more about that in this conference. Maybe that can be the theme of the fourth conference, students as initiators and actors and agents in assessment. And so we've talked about science, but I just want to draw from a recent handbook edited by Heidi Andrade, Randy Bennett, and Greg Sizek. And this is from a chapter by Calkins and colleagues who talk about assessment in writing. And I want to argue that this is how we should be thinking at classroom assessment as a pedagogical tool. That teachers envision what to teach as they assess and confer with their writers. Note, they're not giving their writers a test. And as a mark of expertise to be able to make judgments in the blink of an eye. The reverse is also true. But the ability to grasp what a writer is trying to do and see how to help the writer do that work better, or to tackle something else even more important, represents the epitome of effective writing instruction. I think assessment as a pedagogical tool has got to enable teachers to make those kinds of judgments, to yield insights into learning. And I wanted to note what Angela said, that she found that the open-ended elicitation questions were the most interesting and rich experiences, but how do we help teachers anticipate and respond to student thinking so they can respond in the moment? And from that perspective, one size doesn't fit all. We don't all think the same. It would be very convenient if we had grade levels of students who were in a grade and all thought the same at the same time. Teaching would be so much easier, but that's not the way it works. And Angela also pointed out how hard it is to write questions that really capture the way students think and express that thinking. We have to think about that more as classroom assessment. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all. And I want to conclude with a quote from an NRC document from 1993. Now, this is talking about mathematics, and just think about where we have been and what we've been doing since 1993. And I've put subject in the place of math, but just as good instruction accommodates differences in the ways learners construct knowledge, good assessment accommodates differences in the ways that students think about subject and display understanding. And if we're serious about equity, folks, this is where we need to get to. This is what we've got to be talking about, and I'm going to pick up on that again tomorrow. And my final point is that classroom assessment is not just a tool for pedagogy, it is a tool for learners. as well. Students are as important in the assessment process, if not more important, as other countries are finding out, than teachers. So I'm going to pose 3 questions. How can teachers be supported to examine their existing theories of learning and any inherent limitations therein? How can teachers be assisted to translate curriculum into the kind of teaching practices that have been discussed here and this morning that build on students' existing mental representations and value their ideas? And what role does, can, should classroom assessment play in these reformulations of practice? So I too look forward to conversations around those questions, and thank you very much. And Derek Briggs did not have to drag me off the platform.
So first I wanted to actually respond to something that Margaret said. And no, I know, but I'm also going to answer a question. I like where you landed, but I want to quibble with the term translation. I like to say that no one actually knows what the next generation science standards look like. We all have to figure this stuff out together. And so when we think about it, and the we, in this case, is usually a researcher saying, you teachers do something that you don't know how to do. We need to start with the right metaphors, and for me, translation already puts us off on the wrong foot for partnership. So I talk about this as joint work, and I think that's really important for us to really be clear in our language when we're talking, and it's so hard for us scholars of teacher learning to do that. Because honestly, I don't know what equitable teaching and learning looks like at scale. None of us does, because we haven't seen it, right? So we have to be humble. And so for me, I think that's really important. So you land in the same place. Yeah, do you want to reply?
I do. Certainly. Imagine that. I want to push back a little bit, because if you were listening, you would have heard me say that framing these as partnerships, I completely agree. I mean, but I'm thinking about teachers that don't have the benefits of these kinds of partnerships. And there are millions and millions of teachers across this country who are in classrooms on their own without the support of researchers, without the support of coaches, without the support of district subject matter experts. There you go. There's all the teachers. Hi, guys. And I agree with you. But at the end of the day, the teacher has to make the design decisions, how the implementation goes in the classroom with his or her students. So I'm not disagreeing with you when the partnerships, and I think that's a tremendous goal that we should pursue. My worry is the teachers who aren't in any kind of partnership, even with their own colleagues, folks.
Well, we might be in complete agreement then. So I want to take two quick questions. Can I do that, or do you want? No, I'll hand it off.
No, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I'll just do one. There's a lot of questions about the involving students in assessment, and I want to mention a project with one of our partners, Project Voice, that Carrie Wingert here, who's one of my colleagues, is working with. They're part of our Denver partnership work, and some of the work that we've been doing there is actually we've had these exit tickets that we've co-designed with teachers. And so we actually worked with young people to actually co-develop what they want to see in classrooms, and also use them in their own context of their programmatic work and introduce them to teachers. So I think having students engaged in what are the qualities of experience that we want to see, and then having that have a really significant role in, that's one of the ways that I think that students can say, this is the kind of classroom I want, and this is how, these are the sort of indicators of that.
Well, I just saw a lot of questions up here that are kind of asking about teachers working in professional learning communities, and how can we expect teachers who are really busy to have the time to co-construct these tasks with us. And my response, my totally unfiltered response to that is that, why are we making teachers so busy so that they can't do this? And why is it that we're spending so much money having other people develop tests when teachers doing this work themselves we could spend the money that basically restructure the teacher's workday so they have more time and space to do this, because we know they can design good tasks and we know it supports their learning. It looks at them as professionals and it helps them to improve their practice.
And just to build on that, I'm reflecting on all of this, with my funder hat on, and thinking about ways that funders contribute to or can minimize those challenges that we're encountering. And so I think it's like an ecosystem issue, a bigger ecosystem issue, and I'll be taking that back home with me.
You're getting a lot of questions.
Am I? What are they saying about initiative? Let me give you an example of a classroom. It's in downtown Los Angeles, a very, very impoverished school, very, very impacted population. And in this classroom, I'm just going to paint this picture. I went in late because of the LA traffic. And when I went in there, I sat and observed a conversation between a teacher and the student. And the conversation had been initiated by the student, and I nearly passed out because the child called her teacher over, and she said, she was doing some independent writing, and she said, I'm at the point now, this is a 5th grader, I'm at the point now when I'd like to get your feedback. That's why I nearly passed out. So I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. So the teacher immediately said, absolutely, so help me understand, what's your question, what's your concern? And I actually wrote a paper about this about 3 or 4 years ago. So the child had been doing self-assessment, and her concern was about a rhetorical device in writing. And she wasn't sure about it. And so that was self-initiated assessment. She had assessed her own work against the criteria she'd been given, and she now wanted to use her teacher as a resource, which I think is something else we need to be helping children to see, that their teachers are resources. So that teacher was able to come over, give her some feedback, and then said, now, at the end of the interaction, now can you think about that? Putting the agency back with the child for continuing that learning. So that's what I mean by initiators of assessment. That in the same classroom, I saw another child, we're talking the most impoverished, impacted environment. And I saw another child go to a student, and I saw them reading the work, and I said, can I ask you why you went over and had that conversation? And he said, oh, I wanted to get her feedback. I wanted some peer feedback on this. And I said, do you find that helpful? He says, oh, yeah, she gives really good feedback. But he again was at the point, and so that's what I mean by student-initiated assessment, is the full engagement of children in the learning process and knowing when they want to generate feedback either internally or externally, which is where classroom assessment becomes a tool of pedagogy and a tool of learning.
Well, I'm going to ask this question of the panel, which is, I saw a few questions that were asking about, we're talking about systems-wide change and then talking at the level of the district. So if we want to kind of level up and think about statewide work, how do we think about that?
It's a big question. I think we have a lot to learn by the work districts are big places. They serve multiple communities of parents and students. I think we can learn a lot about, at least in terms of coordinating with that level of the system, but I agree that it does take thoughtful attention to how the state, particularly state assessment systems, are driving particular needs or changes that teachers feel accountable to. So I would agree that probably over time need to think bigger. What would you add, Bill?
So I'm fortunate to be in a partnership with the University of Washington and the Council of State Science Supervisors. for an NSF-funded project called Advancing Coherent and Equitable Systems in State Science Education. Maya Garcia is one of our CDE science coordinator, is a co-PI with me. And one of the things that we've discovered is a real leverage point for change in systems. One is centering the vision. So vision as opposed to any one system component, because usually we center either standards or the tests, instead of what do we want to see going on in classrooms. That's one of the things. The other leverage point has been the professional learning systems that it's not actually through changing state assessment, which many of our state science coordinators that we work with in our partnership work with. It's actually through the professional learning. And even at this level, classroom assessment is a good leverage point, because learning about tasks and analyzing the qualities of tasks and learning how to design those tasks, those are all things that actually help people understand the vision. And they become leverage points for saying, hey, I want some other stuff to change here. My curriculum is not going to follow if this is what the assessments look like. So that's been a real driver for us in terms of understanding that. When those teams work, they have some stability in people and the visions. And also one of the things we've learned too is some regular participatory way to make the vision a shared thing. Vertical coherence doesn't come about by fiat. It comes about through lots of people doing sense making at every level of the system in an ongoing way. And thank you for your time.